Started. Welcome. Thanks for attending today. My marketing director, Gail Boyer, tells me that she's bribing everybody with Starbucks gift cards to attend this. I know that would work for me. Why don't we go ahead and get right into it? So my name is Brian Anderson. I'm a solutions architect at Eagle Technologies. I've been with Eagle for 5 years. Time flies by. I'll talk a little bit more about Eagle over the next couple of slides, but what I wanted to do next before I discuss the agenda was to introduce my co-presenter, or really the presenter, Brian Knopp. Say hi, Mr. Knopp.
Hello, Mr. Anderson.
Hello. So Brian is a regional storage architect. He's been with Nimble for 6 years, you could say since the beginning or the inception. He's got a really cool job. He's a customer-facing resource. He flies all over the country. He's got a really deep knowledge of the product. But what I like best about his job, or what I envy most about his job, is that he spends a lot of time soliciting feedback with customers and then taking that back to folks internally at Nimble. He's been doing this for some time. So he spends a lot of time also working with marketing and more importantly, the software developers and even the founders of Nimble. So Brian, I have a question for you.
Oh.
So what you do is you take the specifications from the customers and you bring them down to the software engineers?
That's true, although I'm worried about automation potentially replacing my job. We'll talk more about InfoSite later, but we have an RFE tool where we can request enhancement, and the customers could do it directly without it even. So,
excellent.
I suppose that's a fair description.
Okay, good. Well, because I was about to ask, why can't the customers just take the specifications directly to the software people, and you got to answer that.
That's all why. Right. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, obviously you can tell that I'm an Office Space fan, and I couldn't help with hitting that reference though. But Brian, anything else you want to say to introduce yourself?
No, sir. I think that's it. Looking forward to telling people more about Nimble.
Okay. One last thing, talking directly to you, Brian. It has been almost a year to the day since we last did this, so time does fly. But getting to the agenda. So what we want to do today is we want to do a quick flyover really of what has made Nimble such a great product. I see a lot of customers attending today, and I see some folks I don't recognize. So we're going to kind of cover what's made the product so great. And as many of you have heard, what has made it the fastest growing storage product of all time, and ultimately what made it the apple of HPE's eye, which we'll also talk about. We'll also talk about what's new in the latest GA software release, which is 4.3. We're going to show off some of the newer stuff in InfoSite, including InfoSite Labs. And then, of course, we'll talk about that acquisition of Nimble by HPE and what that means for current and future customers. And, of course, anything you guys want to get into. I'll talk about Q&A here in a second. But first, I wanted to spend just a couple of slides talking about Eagle before we get to the fun stuff. So let's get to it. So I won't bother building out this slide. As many of you know, Eagle Technologies is an integrator or a VAR. We're really focused on the data center. We've been helping customers in the Midwest for 37 years with, what used to just be the basics, right? The 3-tier architecture, storage, networking, and compute. We also do a lot of business continuity, a whole lot of disaster recovery, legal holds, e-discovery, really data and information management, and all that entails is a specialty of ours. One of the things that I really like about Eagle is that we're a best of breed shop. So we only lead with products that we deem are better than the products that are in that same stable. My other job at Eagle is new technology adoption. So I'm always looking at new products, especially cutting edge products that startup companies are bringing out to the customers. And we're testing them all the time, and we only bring them to the forefront, represent them for our customers if we think they're best of breed. And Nimble's a good example of that. Now I'll talk about that here in a second. We're heavily engineering focused. We average about 4.5 to 5 engineers for every internal sales and marketing person. And we take a lot of pride in that ability to add value to the whole equation. So in terms of our relationship with Nimble, we've been a partner since 2011. Boy, once again, time does fly. That's a long time ago. We're typically the top selling Nimble partner in the Midwest. We are a gold partner. We're fortunate enough that we get to go out yearly to San Jose and do an EBC and meet with the Nimble founders, which is always one of the high points of my year. And we've had a lot of success with Nimble, and we've invested a lot in Nimble. We were the first partner in the Midwest to purchase a Nimble array many, many years ago. we learned pretty quickly that it was such a transformative product that when we would describe it to folks, they would actually tell us that it wasn't possible. So we had to actually have some arrays so we could actually take them out and demonstrate how transformative the product was. All of our managed services and cloud services are powered by Nimble. We also run all of our tier 1 infrastructure on Nimble. And I think that says a lot because we're also a Dell EMC and an HPE partner. So there's no shortage of products that we could have chosen for any of those tasks. And I think finally that the last thing I wanted to say is that, we're up to 300 active Nimble storage arrays out in the field. So we really have had a lot of success with this product. I can tell you personally, it is my favorite storage product that we represent. You won't hear me say that on any of my other presentations. But before I toss it out to Brian Knopp, I really wanted to encourage you guys to ask a bunch of questions. I'm going to be the Q&A guy for the rest of this. I'll write everything down. If it makes sense, I'll interrupt Mr. Knopp and ask him on a particular slide. But otherwise, we'll get to the Q&A at the end and we'll move through all of this. And with that, I'll toss it over to Mr. Knopp. Have at it, buddy.
Thank you, sir. Much appreciated. And as Mr. Anderson mentioned, the goal today is to be as casual as possible. We did put together a couple slides, but do please keep your questions coming, and do feel free to throw us off of our track, if you will. What's important to you and what you would like to discuss is of far more importance to us than the slide deck that we've prepared. So yes, one of the big topics that we should discuss, of course, is this idea of consolidation. And it's something that even prior to the acquisition of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise of Nimble Storage, one of the things that we've been tracking for quite some time has been this pendulum swing. As Mr. Anderson mentioned earlier, this idea that when you bring a disruptive and highly displacing technology to market, it gets a lot of people's attention. Not only are we seeing this within the product itself, but we're seeing this within an industry where folks are demanding more cooperation, and the idea that when something's acquired or another company is brought in, that it's not just a bolt-on, but rather bringing together a holistic solution that solves problems not just within the single product that we're discussing today, but in the data center as a whole. In fact, this transition to a different type of business model is something that we're seeing not just in IT, but in industry across the board. For instance, when we look at Airbnb, they are currently the largest, in terms of revenue, they are the largest hotel operator, if you will, even though they own no properties and lease no properties. When you look at Uber, the largest limousine and transportation company in the world, but yet they own no vehicles whatsoever. So this whole idea and concept of where the industry is going, taking advantage of different business models, but also taking advantage of technologies to help them serve their customers better. Starbucks is an interesting example of this from my hometown in Seattle, where they essentially noticed that there was a good amount of customers not being serviced in the morning, where they would be commuting to work. They would perhaps see the line in the drive-thru or the line inside the store and realize they wouldn't have time to stand in that line, and so they would just either go to a competitor or give it a miss completely. So Starbucks came up with this idea of, hey, let's give everybody an app so that they can pre-do their orders and check queue length, etc., ahead of time before getting their coffee. And the really interesting piece is that not only has this, of course, increased their revenue, increased customer satisfaction, but it's also given them great insight into how to better serve their customers in terms of predicting load and staffing. And Adobe, I think long gone are the days of walking through a Costco or something and seeing tables full of software for sale, where they've switched over to an on-demand business model where if you need the software, you just go to the portal and sign up for some type of reoccurring expense, and you now have access to their software suite. Now, with this constant connectivity and reliance comes the dreaded fear of disconnection or latency within those applications. Indeed, I was recently on a business trip and my phone decided to brick, and I found that as I got up that the phone didn't wake me up in the morning like it was supposed to. I was in a hotel. I was unable to check out of the hotel. I was unable to hail my ride to the airport, and when I got to the airport via an old school taxi, I was unable to even show my boarding pass. So this reliance on the persistent connectivity or cloud only works if we have a complete and full access to the data stack. So where Nimble came in was this idea of we need to start looking at not just the bits and bytes coming in and out of our hard drives, but looking at the data holistically and looking at the data center and troubleshooting as a whole. And we feel like in general that this will be an absolutely amazing fit, even within the HPE family. Indeed, as we look up the stack through the hybrid stack into the compute and software side, we see that there's a huge amount of room for bringing in tools such as InfoSite, and we'll talk some more about that later. Now, just literally 2 weeks ago, I think it was, or three, as Mr. Anders said, time is just flying too quickly. I was recently in Detroit, and they were incredibly excited about the fact that they had taken a self-driving Cadillac with an operator behind the wheel and done a 7-hour round trip into Ottawa and back across the borders. Now, an interesting statistic around self-driving vehicles is Google got a lot of attention when they started using their model or proof of concept for their self-driving vehicle within the Google Maps project. And in so doing, within 6 years' time, they logged 1.5 million miles of road data to help train their automated driving system. Most folks thought that being able to drive 1.5 million miles in 6 years was pretty impressive. Now, Tesla started shipping vehicles with the hardware already on board. So via a software push, they also started collecting similar metrics. And within 6 months, they had collected 45 million miles worth of data. So the just dramatic increase where you have a large customer base sending telemetry data and the ability to train your software by having access to that rich data really is impressive. And where this becomes applicable is when you look at what was occurring, for instance, in the Cadillac trip through Canada and the border crossing. The engineers that were along for that ride said that the human operator had to take control 8% of the time. That is 92% of the time the vehicle was automated and 8% of the time required human intervention. The need to drive that number down to 0% to remove that 8% of human interaction is predicated entirely on the amount of data being collected and the ability to train the system and how to handle those outlying situations. Now, this is a concept we've had at Nimble for quite some time because we're saying, look, if we can take in all this rich telemetry and all these analytics from our entire customer base and use that correlation to build a better system and to improve the systems that are already existing, imagine what we could do to build an automated and completely self-driving storage system, if you will. So we wanted to take that concept, but also make it predictive. That is the idea that we could start to forecast situations as they're occurring in the environment. Now, we have branded this engine InfoSite. For those that aren't aware, InfoSite is our own self-hosted SaaS portal, if you will, that gives our customers a view holistically of their entire environment from a storage perspective, and including some hooks, and we'll show you later, up into the VM and networking pieces. So InfoSite was absolutely one of our strongest differentiators. And what's occurring is essentially based on the configuration of the array, and realize we have tens of thousands of Nimble arrays, including the several hundred that Eagle is tracking, all uploading into our environment. And each one of these arrays is transmitting somewhere between 30 and 70 million sensor points of data every 24 hours. We take that data in and begin to look for problems and look for correlations across multiple bases. It will surprise no one on the line, I don't think, to learn that what our support team has learned is that the majority of the time the problem is not in the storage. Now, most of the time the complaints coming in are pointing towards the storage. If there's an application misbehaving or something that's not quite behaving the way that it should, oftentimes the fingers start pointing. Is it the networking? Is it the compute? Is it the application? And then oftentimes all the fingers start swinging towards the storage. In this instance, we have all the data to show exactly what's occurring and where it's occurring. And our own results showing at this point tend to be that it's not in the storage itself. So as I mentioned, we have all of these metrics and all of this data coming in from the field. That data is being uploaded into our own environment. And another question I get frequently is, what is that data hosted on? Is it a large AWS instance or something like that? And the answer is no, it is absolutely running on Nimble storage. In fact, if you want to get super meta, I can show you InfoSite data about the InfoSite platform that's supporting InfoSite. although that's probably too many layers deep.
That sounds like Inception, Brian.
It is.
Everything slows down.
That's right. So we're taking all of this data in, but we're also doing a couple other things. For instance, if you have a vSphere environment and you want to have a look into VMware's behavior or the behavior of individual machines, you can enable VM Vision. This is a non-licensed feature, so it's just an opt-in. And if you choose to opt in and give some sort of service credentials into the API on the vSphere side, we start collecting that data as well, and we can start to show trends and analysis across the entire environment. Another thing to keep in mind here is that this is on all the time. So when someone stops you in the hallway and says, hey, last week on Tuesday at 8 p.m., I was doing something and something happened, your response doesn't have to be, well, let me know the next time that happens and I'll try to catch it. Rather, you can just log into InfoSite, scroll back in time to when that was occurring and see if something was actually occurring on the storage side, or if we're pointing towards the fact that it might be in the networking or somewhere else. So another cool feature is that this isn't just an on-demand or something that you have to fire up in advance, but something that is tracking historical issues as well. So when I first started at Nimble years ago, the number was in the 60s, quickly grew to the 70s, and I'm loving the fact that I can now say it's 86% and climbing. But right now, 86% of our current tickets are all proactively and automatically opened by the InfoSite engine itself and solved and resolved by the InfoSite engine itself, meaning that the rest required some type of intervention. For instance, support personnel got involved or a human called in for some reason.
Hey, Brian, if I can stop you, the 86% that are automatically open and solved, is that because the customer is given instructions on how to solve the issue or just made aware of it?
Typically, no. It's something where, let's say that there was a hard drive being predicted that it will fail, not necessarily a drive has failed. So we're noticing trends in analysis, and keep in mind that we have back in things such as lot numbers and batch numbers of drives, et cetera. So we can say that, hey, the customer A 6 months ago experienced a thermal event where their air conditioning went out in the data center, and we saw 2 drives from this lot fail. The rest of the drives seem to be okay. When customer B then also experiences a similar thermal event in their environment, and we start to notice that, for instance, we're starting to see an increase in failure rates from a specific drive, we can take that same correlated data and get a fairly accurate prediction as to when that drive will, quote unquote, completely fail. And so we pre-dispatch the drive to the customer along with, or if the customer had on-site replacement, we just swap the drive out for them. So in other words, it's not just oh, hey, you did something dumb, here's how to fix it, but oftentimes we're spotting issues before they occur and trying to proactively run out ahead of it. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I have a question for you. I honestly don't know the answer. Do you know of any of your competitors that do that? I mean, it sounds so impressive that you're looking at lot numbers and you're correlating, when a drive's going to fail ahead of time to that extent.
Yeah, well, I think realistically, the thing that would prevent anybody else from doing that is the fact that you have to have this absolutely massive database, this absolutely massive engine on the back end that's absorbing all of these different metrics from all, if you think about it, from many different aspects, whether that's manufacturing, whether that's QA, whether that's the actual customer base. Indeed, when we show a demo to a customer and show just the GUI piece, which often can take hours to walk through everything that's involved in the software side or the customer-facing portal, that is only representative of roughly 1% of the available data. So what we have really worked hard is to make sure that all of our charts and reporting are very clean and very simple, but have the data that's needed. And yet we can never predict that there'll be one customer that comes back with, hey, I have this type of audit that's coming up and I need access to this type of information, or we're trying to troubleshoot something else that is, for instance, occurring within the networking and iSCSI packets or something like that. We don't know in the future what's going to be needed to troubleshoot something or to provide data on something. So we just capture everything. and by capturing and inhaling literally everything that we can, this allows us to, down the road, come up with some interesting ideas. In fact, that's a interesting path we could take in terms of talking about InfoSite labs. I'll show some of that later on. But essentially what we learned was that we have so many requests for things coming so quickly that we need to have a quick way of presenting alternate reports and ways for people to create their own reports from data that we haven't have thought to have created before. So
that's very cool.
So no,
I did have a question,
aware.
Brian.
Yes, go for it.
How long do you keep the analytics data in the InfoSite engine?
So the customer-facing piece of it will have records for up to a year. Then we archive it off to in the back end to more storage. But keeping the searchable data right there at your fingertips, we do that for over a year. And then at the year plus mark, we archive that data. We still have it on hand, and we can use it for our own reporting and custom reports the customer may want. But just from a searchability and instant request standpoint, it's over a year.
Yeah, so not to get too far off the rails, but you guys really do subscribe to that notion of big data, where you haven't figured out all the ways to get value out of the data, so you're going to keep all of it.
That's right. Yep. Because again, it's really hard to predict what data you're going to need in the future to troubleshoot something, or what data is going to be interesting or valuable to correlate data in the future. So in our minds, it's better, just like in the self-driving car analogy, just keep it all and use it for reporting and data mining later on.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, and one of the things that this can lead us to here is, or what we were talking about here is, in terms of uptime. I also think we might be the only vendor that when we're reporting uptime, we are talking about our actual field arrays, not lab measured or QA boxes uptime. We do know InfoSite is not a licensed feature. InfoSite is provided as part of the maintenance package within Nimble. So it's truly an opt-in. And we know about 4% of our customers are unable to opt in, whether that's because it requires transmitting metadata into the US or for other security purposes. But we know that the remaining 96% of our customers who are transmitting, choosing to transmit this data from their base, as we measure our field actual real world uptime, we are greater than 6 nines uptime, not just in the lab, but in the real world. NPS score is a fun one too. NPS score of 85, meaning that a lot of people and a lot of long-term customers really do enjoy our product and are actually happy to to recommend it to other people. So that's InfoSite, and as I mentioned, I think we'd rather just sort of open it up to questions in a moment and show you the actual InfoSite portal rather than walking you through any further slides on that topic. But briefly, I did want to talk about the actual infrastructure pieces as well, and the parts that Nimble has that could be installed on your premises in your data center. So we have essentially 3 primary array products: the all-flash array, the secondary flash array, and the converged storage or CS series hybrid platform, if you will. Now, all of these are all 4U in height, and they all run the same operating system. Indeed, the controllers in the rear, the parts doing the actual data processing, are the same across all devices as well. So truly the only difference amongst these different products is the media types that you will find in the front, whether that's SSD or spinning media. So typically that's what it comes down to. The feature sets in terms of snapshots, application integration, VMware integration, Veeam integration, Docker integration, et cetera, all of those are universal across the entire product suite. When it comes to scalability, this is something that typically takes a long time to impress on customers. I think Mr. Anderson correctly stated it earlier when he said, "I don't believe you," but it's this idea that we can scale performance. That is, we can take a hybrid array with some spinning media and some SSD in the array, upgrade the controllers only, non-disruptively, and increase the IOPS and sequential throughput of that box without touching the media itself. That's typically one of those cases where those who are well experienced in the storage world go, "Hang on, I know there's something going on there." And indeed, we have to prove it to them, right? But it is something that absolutely does occur. Nimble is a CPU-bound architecture, not a media-bound architecture. So the more you increase our CPUs, the more cores you give us, the faster we go. So we could do a hot in-place performance upgrade without having to swap media types. Now, we can also scale out. That is to say, customers who aren't necessarily interested in going faster, they just need more more space to save data, we can non-disruptively hang expansion shelves and grow just by adding expansion shelves. Now, in our world, adding expansion shelves doesn't increase the IOPS. As I mentioned, we're a CPU-bound architecture, but it does mean that you can grow in the most cost-effective manner, whether that's needing more IOPS or needing more capacity, or a combination of both. Indeed, if you do need to go in a direction that increases both capacity and a linear increase in performance, we have the ability of scaling out as well. That is grouping multiple nodes together and striping the data across them. Or if you prefer not to stripe the data across multiple nodes, if you just want a single pane of glass for management, we can do that as well. As far as I'm aware, we are the only manufacturer that's capable of independently growing in all three vectors. And when it comes to the cost, the usable, if you will, we don't play games when it comes to dedupe and compression and thin provisioning and claiming that thin provisioning gives you some sort of 10,000 to 1 dedupe ratio or something like that. We do thin provision by default. We do compress by default without impacting performance. And we do allow deduplication to be selectively enabled or disabled on a per LUN volume or folder basis. So we do have all of the standard data compaction technologies that you would expect. However, when it comes to the customer that says, I'm only going to send you encrypted data, and so I expect you not to be able to dedupe or compress that data, our usable ratios are industry leading in terms of when you have a brand new box and how much data can be saved to that compared to the amount of media in that rack space. We're incredibly efficient. In fact, usually more than a third more efficient than our competition. But the cool part about this whole aspect is that is before we even get into the data reduction technologies, and that is with RAID 6 triple parity plus protection on top. So you're not making sacrifices in terms of multi-terabyte drives, perhaps suffering data loss while those rebuild, those types of concerns. And all of that ties into the absolute resiliency. So the other piece that I'll mention too is that when it comes to the Nimble software, things like snapshots and replication are also built in to the appliance by default. They are not performance impacting, and they are universal across all of the platform types. And indeed, we don't have a compatibility matrix of what can replicate to what. So you can have an all-flash array replicating, for instance, to a hybrid or CS array.
Hey, Brian, can you
Sir.
go back real quick? I have
Absolutely.
one question about the secondary flash array, and maybe
Yes.
to tee it up a little bit. My interpretation of the secondary flash array is that it's very similar to the hybrid array, except that it can hold more metadata and thus do global deduplication. Am I in the ballpark there?
Yep, absolutely. So dedupe has always shipped on our all-flash array, and it historically has not shipped on the hybrid array, which has compression and thin provisioning, but does not do deduplication. So yes, indeed, the secondary flash was pushed basically with the idea of being a deep repository. In other words, it has a lot of system memory resources on board ready to handle a large amount of deduplication. Now, going forward, and we can talk about roadmap as the call progresses, but long term, basically all of our products will have some type of deduplication on board. But in the interim, at this moment in time, the all-flash array has deduplication. The secondary flash appliance also has deduplication. The current hybrids do not, but all products do have compression and thin provisioning.
Okay, so you've kind of already answered this question, but is there any reason why you couldn't use the secondary flash array as a tier 1 storage device, to host applications?
No, indeed, it's the idea with this is that you should be able to selectively run, just like you would anything that be able to run it in production, if you will. The idea that back in the day when we had some type of backup to disk appliance that was very good at inline deduplication and just really, really squeezing a lot of data into a small footprint, the pain point there was that if you did have to actually do a restore or help a degraded environment where you may have dropped a server or lost access to some of your storage, what Nimble historically has been able to do with the CS series, with the hybrid arrays, is show that we are able to run applications on a hybrid box that is able to sustain sub-millisecond reads and writes. And as you mentioned earlier, this idea that prove it. I don't believe you. I don't believe that a hybrid array can run sub-millisecond reads and writes on applications in the way that our Castle file system works in caching is how we're able to do it. There's no smoke and mirrors. It's just a brilliant and elegant engineering solution. Now, what this is with the secondary flash appliance here is exactly that. It is still a hybrid array. It still has that caching mechanism and SSD on board. So to your point, unlike previous backup to disk appliances, if it comes time to stand something up, or the fact that you may have to run, actually run your DR environment on a backup appliance, this is something that we want to occur without creating resumes for you. No resume generating events during an outage is our goal.
Cool. Yeah, it's a really interesting option you guys brought into your portfolio. So I just wanted to kind of hop on it for a second and talk in more detail. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, and do keep all the questions coming. I think the final infrastructure piece that we have is cloud. Yes, I did say cloud and infrastructure at the same point. A lot of times we're having conversations with customers who have some type of footprint, whether that's AWS or Azure. Some applications are running in premises, and some are running, for instance, test and dev is running. And then more and more we're talking to folks where their cloud presence, whether that's AWS, Azure, et cetera, started in the cloud and then accidentally went into production, or it was scheduled to go into production. But now our customers are dealing with a black hole or black box issues. That is to say, I was with a customer recently, a very large enterprise customer, that said we had no official cloud strategy. In fact, no one was technically allowed to use it, and yet we were still paying a bill on a monthly basis of around 40 to 60 grand. So somebody was using some things there. But then all of a sudden, one day they get a bill and it's for around 300K. And they said, hang on a second, what happened overnight? And there's just no visibility into what's consuming those resources. So our first request from customers was, hey, we really love InfoSite. We love what it's doing with the Nimble piece. We now need InfoSite on other pieces of our storage environment. And can you please hook that into the cloud as well? Now, we were not able to hook it into AWS or Azure, but what we are able to do is provide our own cloud volumes. That is to say, it's the world's most boring demo. You'll go to cloud.nimblestorage.com. Partnered with Eagle, you will find that you can selectively choose as small as 1 terabyte and then grow in a very flexible manner. And essentially all you do is put in the basically the corporate card and choose your VPS and your security key. And by the time you get back to your AWS or Azure portal and reset your VPS, you'll notice that you now have X amount of storage, and it's billed in the same manner as you would expect cloud storage to be billed. Now, this is not running as a VM, and if there's questions on this, I can explain that. This is actual Nimble hardware that is connected over a low latency peering connection. But essentially what you get is actual enterprise grade, greater than 6 nines availability with encryption and compression and all the features that you would expect. And the strong piece here is the ability to replicate from your cloud instances to your on-prem. So if you have Nimble in your environment, Nimble at your DR location, and Nimble in your cloud instances, you can replicate and share data amongst those and even execute HA failover policies, etc. So what we wanted to do is say that for folks who are unsure of what their future cloud strategy may or may not hold, an investment in Nimble at this point in time is actually a good investment in terms of getting you ready for an on-ramp or getting you ready to prepare for some of that stuff down the road.
Yeah,
go ahead,
Brian, if I could just add, I think one of the reasons when I talk to customers, there's actually 2 reasons that people are really interested in Nimble Cloud Volumes. And the first is that when you look at some of these cloud providers, they're typically 3.9 storage. So whereas you guys average, I believe, 23 seconds of downtime per year, 3.9 storage is averaging over 8 hours of downtime per year. So these traditional enterprise apps that aren't clustered, they don't suffer those outages very well. So we see a lot of customers interested in your product for that reason. And then, of course, I think the other obvious purpose is for DR to the cloud, right? You can eliminate that second data center, but still embrace Nimble technology, Nimble replication, and all that visibility that you discussed earlier. So I see a lot of interest for those 2 reasons.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think one of the when we first announced this product, keep me honest here. I think it was about 9 months ago now. Is that right?
Yeah.
Where AWS had a massive outage. If folks remember, many major providers were down that day, and the end result being that someone unfortunately mistyped a command in and managed to take down the AWS piece. We had just literally announced this offering that same day. And we had announced that we had several beta customers that had been operating for some time in this way. And the end result at the end of the day and at the end of that outage was that our beta customers that were running actually stayed up, because it was actually the storage piece that had gone down and had caused the outage. And in fact, the Register, if that's a trade magazine that folks follow, the Register almost accused us lightheartedly of perhaps causing the outage to demonstrate what 6 nines of uptimes mean, even in an AWS environment.
That's some pretty good evil genius stuff there, Brian.
Yeah, I'd like to claim credit for that, but I can't. I think the last piece that I had to discuss here is converged infrastructure. Now, we've talked about going forward with HPE and some of the pieces that we're going to provide. 2 things are going to occur. First of all is the expansion of InfoSite and making InfoSite even increasing its ability to collect data from more aspects, not just Nimble appliances. So as we continue to build that piece out, we also want to tightly integrate and build an environment where customers are able to rapidly provision, just like you would in a cloud, in that if you want to spin something up quickly or rapidly provision in the environment, we want to tie into all of that so that not only are your blades and networking and other aspects provisioned in a composable way, but that the storage piece stands in lockstep with that, not creating extra work, but perhaps even making that composable piece even more slick, if you can. more efficiency. We don't want to sit around all day installing things anymore. It's time to let that all be automated. So the piece I'll leave you with all of this in terms of the timeless model especially is that everything we've talked about, we have an all-inclusive model. There just simply isn't a place in the Nimble product line to type in a license key. So whether that's features such as encryption at rest or other features within the array itself, and indeed software, the integration within, and I'll show you this within InfoSite, but integration with the various software pieces, whether that's Microsoft or VMware, Veeam, all of those different products, Commvault, all of those we make sure that we provide all-inclusive as well. Same thing with the flat support pricing, no games there. We have the idea that the controllers are something that we can be swapping in and out over time, and so as compute gets more cost-effective, as Intel keeps releasing faster and faster chipsets, we're able to basically keep in step with that by swapping out your controllers with you. And the idea that as where we say future-proofed, it's a phrase I'm not particularly fond of, but Mr. Anderson, you nailed it earlier when you said back in the day we were talking to folks and they were saying, I don't believe you, fairly often. One of the fun conversations back then was, what type of SSDs are you guys using? Now, it's an archaic conversation now, but back then we were saying, is it SLC or MLC? And folks had various opinions of that. And we kept saying, well, it's not the media, it's the compute. So the faster the compute goes, the faster we can go. So we'll just use whichever media is the most dense, not necessarily the most performant. Now, over time, where we also were talking about spinning media, and folks were saying, well, why aren't you using 15K or 1500 RPM drives in your arrays, and we're using 7200 RPM drives? What's wrong with the 15Ks? And we say, well, again, we could have used the smaller capacity but more expensive 15Ks, or we can give you a better price performance with the 7200 RPM drives, simply because our performance is not coming from the media. Now, here we are, it's 2017. Everyone is talking about what now? Well, no one's talking about SLC or MLC or 7200 RPM drives. In fact, everyone's done talking about SSDs, it feels like. We're all on to NVMe. And we're seeing yet again the pendulum swing, and the fact that our castle architecture and this idea that back in the day, the fastest media at the time from being able to throw into a storage appliance was SSD, and the most cost-effective dense storage media at the time was the 7200 RPM spinning media. we absolutely see a future coming up shortly here where that will just all shift up one level, and that is to say NVMe will perhaps start to take the place of SSD, and SSD will start to take the place of spinning media. Now, the point I'll leave on top of all of this from an architectural perspective is that throughout this entire 7-year period, Nimble has always been using NVDIMMs for read and write. So we've always been, from a latency perspective, faster than NVMe, and we expect that to also continue going forward. So that's just adding a little bit on the future-proofed piece. And then finally, for the last 2 bits here, for those who really want to focus on the Gartner piece, we feel like we have made absolutely, before we were really proud of our progress within Gartner just as a standalone company. Broke records and established some pretty new and compelling of movement from a market perspective. With HP behind us, this of course now just gets stronger. And indeed, when you look at some of the ratings across, just in general of what HPE and Nimble together bring, we do feel like we now have a full best of breed portfolio where if you feel like there's some aspects or some areas in your environment that Nimble's not quite the fit for, do realize that as a family, we now have a much greater offering there. So those were the final pieces I had, Mr. Anderson. I figure at this point, we probably want to open it up to questions as well as start talking about the InfoSite piece and or actually showcasing some of the aspects there. So if you're good with it, I'll just keep working on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have some questions, and to your point, let's try to get through them, and then maybe we'll show off InfoSite Labs. So one question that I actually got a couple of times, and once again, maybe I'll tee it up, is that if you've worked in IT for long enough, especially if you have any gray hairs like I do, you've probably bought a product that you were a little bit in love with, right? And ultimately, a large company bought it, and then something happened, right? The support got sucky. I'll use the word sucky, not the word I was thinking. Or the development slows, or it just doesn't become what you thought it was going to become. So I've gotten a couple questions that are basically saying, what is the impact that the HPE purchase is going to have on Nimble? Is it going to affect product development? Is it going to affect support? What can you tell us to make us feel better about that acquisition?
Yep. So one of the most obvious pieces, of course, is the absolute love fest that HPE has shown Nimble during this acquisition. I think HPE is recognizing, along with most of the others in the storage communities, that there has been a massive overnight transition within storage. The idea of large monolithic arrays and multiple weeks of PS to get things installed and operational is absolutely a thing of the past. So with that, I wouldn't claim that HPE came to Nimble wanting us because we had a really good bezel or a really good faceplate. In fact, one of the more compelling pieces what we've learned over time is this idea, especially around InfoSite, is something that absolutely scales. And indeed, this was one of the first things that caused me to seriously consider switching my employer. And by that, I mean, I quit my job and signed up full time with Nimble. And this was years ago. But basically what we noticed was that within InfoSite, the piece that typically fell off the wheel, or the wheels that typically fell off the wagon first, was the support side, as you mentioned. So as a company, not just from an acquisition perspective, but even from a hyper-growth perspective, as you start to add more and more customers, the company itself can become a victim of its own success. That is to say that the more customers trying to get support, or the more customers experiencing issues, the more the support engine itself can be overwhelmed. I believe Nimble is the first to have turned this on its head, not just from within the storage communities, but I would say in IT as well, where the more customers we've added, the more data that we get, the quicker we are at spotting issues and finding resolution to those issues, the more efficient our support organization becomes. Typically, what you see with hypergrowth companies or companies that are looking for cost cutting, they will look at the support organization and say, okay, well, we have people taking phone numbers numbers and serial numbers and checking support contracts, that's easily outsourced. The next level is probably could be outsourced with a flow chart and a 3-ring binder. So really, we'll just keep around the old guys that know what's going on and outsource the rest of it. And in those worlds and in those acquisitions, that's typically where you see the the support trend towards sucky. Um, what is different in this aspect is Nimble has already completely automated the tier 1 and tier 2 aspects of the support engine. In other words, there really isn't any other room for cost optimization. What we have already is a lean machine that is able to address a large number of customers at the base. 2, when we start looking at how the correlation helps, the idea that our support organization isn't blindly trying to find answers to problems, but rather has a really large set of data to look at, we find that that's far more cost effective when there are hooks in with the rest of the organization. In other words, can the support organization look at data within the same family? In this case, I will say, for instance, Aruba, or looking at other aspects within the compute environment. That is absolutely something that HPE appears to be heavily interested in, and in fact seems to be one of the greatest points of development going forward. So I suppose the message I'm receiving as a Nimble employee acquired by HPE has been that HPE is increasing its investment and development of InfoSite, and in fact intends to expand that piece of it, and as well as building out all of the feature sets that we've been talking out today and continuing to support those. So I absolutely do completely understand the caution and the sort of wait and see approach. But so far, we're seeing a huge amount of expansion in this area.
Are there any plans to roll product development or support into a bigger ship?
So far as we can tell, all of that stands alone, and our support organization continues to be commingled within our development offices as well. So we have multiple locations, both in San Jose, in Minneapolis, and in Raleigh, North Carolina, as well as the UK, and a few other handful of offices that are all in-house, where our developers cohabitate with our support engineers. Again, because our support engineers are what would typically be considered a tier 3 engineer, that is someone who could directly escalate to engineering. We want them to be able to just sort of prairie dog, if you will, or stick their head up and get some help on something without having to go through an elaborate escalation mechanism. So that type of lean organization, long term, is very, very efficient already, and so that's apparently the model we're going to be sticking with.
I like what I'm hearing. Let's see, I got a couple other questions. It looks like you're going to jump into InfoSite here in a second. Here's a question that I actually get quite a lot. Does InfoSite tie into any other hypervisors besides VMware? And if not, are there any roadmaps to do so?
Yep. So where we're able to pull a lot of that correlation data is via the VMware API. That is to say, no software is installed in ESX, no software is installed on your vCenter server. Literally, you go into the array itself and give service credentials for vSphere to the array. The array then connects via vSphere's API and begins pulling that data for correlation into InfoSite. So we are at the mercy, or the reporting, if you will, of the hypervisor itself, because we are agentless. So when it comes to, for instance, Hyper-V, we do have integration with SEVMM and other aspects, for instance, VSS listeners. So we can do things such as a VSS quiesce snapshot of a Hyper-V guest. However, we're at the mercy from a reporting perspective of just what Hyper-V itself is logging. And at this moment in time, that's not robust, although we are working with Microsoft in terms of what they will be launching going forward. Same thing we started looking at a little bit within KVM and some of the other hypervisors, and again, in those instances, we are at the mercy of what they're able to log and report to us on their own. Now, I will say that there's a slightly different story when it comes to, for instance, Docker and composability with Docker, where we are able to support both Windows and Linux instances of Docker. And from a composability perspective and rapid deployment, while I know that's not a hypervisor, we do have a huge amount of integration and plugin, and that we will be looking a lot in terms of containers going forward and reporting within applications and VMs or containers themselves, and the ways different containers are behaving. So there's a lot to come still on that, but when it comes to the actual metrics collected, we are at the mercy of the hypervisors themselves.
Okay, so it sounds like there's an interest, but it's going to take some participation.
Yes, or we abandon waiting, for instance, for Microsoft to do something, and we write an agent, which maybe somebody will do over the weekend. But typically, what we find with customers and the feedback we've gotten is that they really like not having to install things on the guests or on the hypervisors themselves. They'd rather leave that clean, and so in that aspect, we're trying to avoid that methodology.
Okay, excellent. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to smash up a couple of these questions together. We're getting a lot of questions about what's new with 4.3. If there's anything you can say about a timetable with version 5. And also, are there any major changes coming to InfoSite? So just in general, what's about ready to drop? What's coming? Is there anything you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, why don't we use that as an opportunity? Let me minimize my screen here. And I'll bet by now I have been signed out here, but let's find out.
Well, maybe while you're talking, I'll share one thing.
Please.
From a selfish perspective, I really love sizing Nimble arrays for customers, because all of the data that you have at your disposal, you actually give us something called the sizer. So I can put in your read block size and your write block size and your peak or your 95th percentile IOPS and your read-write ratio. And I can actually determine which controller is going to work best for you. And I can even tell the customer what percentage the CPUs are going to be working at peak. So it gives me a lot of confidence sizing the solution. It makes my job a lot easier, but it also gives the customers a lot of confidence that it's sized properly. So to your point earlier, Brian, we don't create any resume generating events when we put this stuff into production. So I'm a huge fan of InfoSite. I'll just leave it at that.
As am I, and I love being able to just quickly find things, or if someone's asking me a question about it, just be able to pull something up. So a couple of your questions that were stacked up together there is future software releases, as well as what's going on with InfoSite itself. So for folks on the line that aren't aware, when we are talking about different version numbers, note that 4.3.1 is currently a GA candidate. This means that we feel like it's production ready and should be available, should be just fine to run in production. However, before we will mark it as approved, we want to make sure that we are exceeding that uptime, those uptime numbers that we've talked about before. So we have what we call a soak time, or system years time, where we are literally at the mercy of our customers who have opted to roll the dice, if you will, and run this 4.3 code in their environments. And anyone who wants to do so that would like to upgrade is welcome to do so. We have a simple whitelist procedure to get you on there. But once we have the certain number of system years or soak time available, that's when we mark it as generally available, and you'll see that change from GA candidate or GAC to generally available or GA. We are currently looking to mark 4.3 as GA, and we hope to do so here as soon as we get the number of system years required to say that it is a stable release in the field. Once we've done that, we'll start looking at the next version, which most people will not be surprised to learn will be called 5.0. And typically we try to do a major release every year. So the schedule for 5.0 would be the beginning of next year, and then we try to do a sub-release about every 6 months. And then maintenance releases on a quarterly basis. So what we'll see there is just a continued release of the software and new features that are coming in that. Now we can talk about what is coming in 4.3, and in fact, anyone who wants specifics can actually just go right into our documentation and look at release notes. And as we were talking about this earlier, we were saying, hey, we just want to see what's going on within VMware itself, so we can, or I'm sorry, within itself. So we can pop into the Nimble OS and take a look at all of the features that are coming, including things like quality of service. We have automatic QoS running on the arrays now, and what customers wanted was the ability to set limits. For instance, we wanted to we want it to be able to set a maximum. Application consistent snapshots is another one for Hyper-V that I mentioned. This one too is one that shouldn't be understated. Framework for integrating snapshots with any application, quite a claim there. But with our API and some of the new things that we've announced, the ability to quickly script things via PowerShell, or if Bash is your preferred way of setting scripts, we're able to do that as well. So again, too many things to go into in the time that we have remaining on the call here, but if there's any specific questions about that, the folks at Eagle are highly knowledgeable about this and can walk you through some of the upcoming features and things that are ready.
Yeah, excellent. Is there any big features coming out in 5 that you can share now?
Not without being fired, but SyncRep is something that we've been working on for quite some time.
Okay. Hey, there is a blog post about that. They just won't admit when it's going to come out.
That's right. That's right. So basically, we've had replication for many years at this point, but it is snapshot-based replication. That is to say, I think the GUI locks you from replicating more than once every 5 minutes. So basically, customers that wanted a replication window of less than 5 minutes, that wanted near real-time synchronous replication to occur, has been a major ask from our customer base. So that is something that's been in development. If anyone wants to see a demonstration of that, I think that's something that we could set up at a future date here pretty shortly. Anyone that wants to see how that works. But essentially for existing customers, it's the story that you're used to and have been used to for some time now. When you upgrade to the newest version of the Nimble OS, you will see the new features enabled and be able to take advantage of them.
Excellent. Last question. I'm going to actually have to leave some questions hanging. I'll reply to folks offline if I didn't get a chance to answer them now. Anything big and/or new coming out in InfoSite itself? I know we're going to talk about labs, and we're too chatty. We ran out of time.
Yep.
But maybe something you can comment on there in a couple of minutes.
So the cool part about the InfoSite piece is it doesn't require any customer interaction to upgrade or update. So if you haven't signed into InfoSite in a while, this may actually look slightly different than what you're used to. The new GUI is available in the 4.x code as well, so you'll see a similar GUI change within the Nimble array. But this GUI update that you're seeing in front of you in InfoSite right now was something that we pushed out. We've done a huge amount of work on the back end getting ready to scale to really just insane proportions. So there's been a massive amount of back-end work that probably isn't interesting to people on the line here, except to realize that we are getting ready to just start taking in way more data than we ever thought we would before. So on that piece and some of the other features, that's the answer there. Now, one of the other things when it comes to this, Brian, you mentioned briefly, was this idea of labs. Things that are not available in the GUI right now, but customers wanted, for instance, things we've done one-off for customers to help them or planning. These are tools we're starting to provide in the labs just so that it's something that we can get to the customer maybe the day of or the week of, rather than having to wait for a full development cycle to get it locked into the InfoSite portal as a whole. So not only are there a lot of cool things coming and already in place, and probably different from the last time you even logged in, but we also are now building out a more modular rapid deployment area, labs, where we're able to bring features out even faster. So again, this isn't something that is being put on the back burner, and this is something that we're doubling down on.
Yeah, excellent. I would add that you guys all have access to this if you've got InfoSite access. And if you look in the upper right, I had one question: what decide what goes and what stays in labs? The answer is you guys. Oh, Brian, down one. Yep. Under give feedback.
Yes.
If you like something, let them know. They're actually looking to see if these features add value and if they should make it into the core, I guess I would say, GUI or layout of InfoSite. So
yes, yeah, we're not interested in building things if people don't want it. So we continue to be driven. We don't do the focus group thing. We just ask our actual customers and say, tell us what you want, and we will build it.
Yeah. And we joked earlier about Brian taking his requests from the customers down to the engineers. This is an example where you guys really can bypass us, and you can leave direct feedback with the folks that decide how this evolves. So, Brian, I could keep going with questions, but it's 10:58, and I hate to keep people past the hour. So I tell you what, I always like to close with next steps. what I would say to the folks listening is, hey, we really appreciate your time. It looks like we've got about 50 folks on, so you guys definitely earned your Starbucks coffee. I'd be more than happy to take you out for another coffee too. But there's a lot of great options for next steps. We can run what Nimble calls the site analyzer, so we can analyze your environment. I talked earlier about getting those metrics so that I could tell you exactly how busy a certain controller is going to be. That would be a quick way to get there. We love to come on site and dig deeper. This product is getting really mature, and we could probably spend an hour on 4 or 5 different topics. One of the things I like best about Nimble is that they still have free training. So quarterly in some areas, monthly in some of the larger cities, you can go out and spend a day learning about the product. About half of our customers, before they become Nimble customers, actually go to this training. You leave this training, you're even certified to do your own installations. The product's that easy to install. But to be honest, they go in pretty deep. The test at the end isn't easy to pass. I've actually had some of my customers fail, and yes, I give them you-know-what for it. And then finally, we don't have to do it as much as we used to, put our money where our mouth is, but we're always ready to set up a proof of concept or bring an array out and invite you to try to break it. I can honestly say that people tend to fall in love with Nimble storage arrays, so it's dangerous. I'm just warning you, if you get one of these in your environment, you're going to want to keep it. So with that, we're at 10:59. Brian, I really appreciate your time coming from the other Brian. Hopefully we go maybe 6 months this time instead of a year before we get you back on here. But I will add that Mr. Knopp just moved to Seattle, and he's probably got his laptop sitting on a pile of boxes right now. So it was really awesome that he was able to attend this, and you do such a great job considering he probably doesn't even have any comfortable furniture yet. So thanks, Mr. Knopp.
Thank you, everyone, for your time today.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. I'll follow up with questions if I didn't answer them. Thank you.